So I'm here talking with Dr. Kathleen Peroff, who has had a distinguished career in the federal government of about 30 years, I'd say, and left the federal service, what, maybe 2 years ago now?
3 years.
3 years, gosh. But you were there at OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, for most of your career, I think, for maybe
about 29 years.
29 years at OMB. And started out as a researcher, analyst, became a senior executive responsible for the housing budget, and later Deputy Associate Director for the Energy and Science programs for a few years, heading that division of career civil servants, and then moved over to National Security Division, where you spent, what, maybe?
The last 13 years.
13 years of your career. And have won the highest presidential rank awards for your service. Quite a distinguished, impressive career. As head of the National Security Division, you and your staff of about how many people?
It varied, but I would say we had about 45 people.
45 people, and you were responsible for the defense budget, which...
Yes, the defense budget plus, of course, the intelligence budget, which is subsumed within the National Security Budget function, and also the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is part of the Department of Energy, and then lastly the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Okay, so all of those allied functions.
Right.
And then the Pentagon itself, the Defense Department, its budget, last time I looked, is over $600 billion a year, which is, I think, equal to the next 14 nations' defense budgets, approximately, something like that, around the world.
Yeah, sounds like a good figure.
If it were a country, I don't know,
yeah,
it would be a big
right.
country, right?
It's certainly a good half, if not more than half, of the total discretionary pie.
And then you throw in Veterans Affairs and the so on. You had a staff of 45 people who were responsible for the for that big complex set of agencies and all that they did, Can you talk a little bit about what that was like? What sort of things did you and your staff do? How did you spend most of your time? Was it on the budget? Was it on other issues? Was it firefighting or dealing with emergencies and wars and things like that? How would you characterize the work?
Well, when I took over the division, it was in 2000. And then, obviously, 2001, we had a new world order, and
Right.
For the next probably 10 years, there was just an extraordinary amount of attention being focused to the war effort. And there was this continual budgeting for what was first called GWAT, or Global War on Terrorism, and then it was renamed to OCO, Overseas Contingency Operation money.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that was the highest priority at that point, getting the funds to the warfighter, as the Department of Defense always said, and of course as well to the intelligence community. So I would say that for a large number of years, the intensity of our effort was really focused on that. And you can imagine what that's like, because you're fighting a war simultaneously with trying to integrate the needs on the ground with the budget process that you have. Sometimes they don't always work together.
It doesn't lend itself to an orderly annual cycle of budgeting.
No, and over time we changed the way we did it, thankfully. At first we were doing supplementals, and then
supplemental appropriations requests?
Supplemental appropriations requests, sometimes formal, sometimes informal requests. Of course, all of those were considered emergencies. And then we went to, I think, a more rational system where we, knowing that this war was going to be an ongoing war, we prepared the war request, or the OCO request, simultaneously with the base budget request, and sent that up in the February budget. you know, I think I'd say two or three things. One, certainly the most important thing was to make sure that the war fighters, as they were called at that time, and the intelligence fighters, all of those people, and some of the homeland security activities that were funded in OCO got the money they needed. That was, but secondly, you know, OMB in its role also had to make sure that as much as possible we weren't trying to fund a huge amount of base kinds of activities in the OCO budget. And why is that? Because it's essentially, that becomes then a pressure valve to reduce pressure on reduce the need to make trade-offs in the base budget.
Because it's if there are caps in place, as there are for other defense spending, it's outside the caps. It's
That's
essentially
exactly
uncapped.
right. And so we have, I don't know what the exact number is right now, but certainly 1.5 to 2 trillion that we've spent through OCO since the beginning. It's a lot of money outside the caps. And you know, it does raise basic questions about, well, this is an ongoing activity essentially now. Should this really be outside the caps or within the base budget? And we had that debate over and over again. I think ultimately the policy call was that there was no way to account or cover all of the warfighting needs along with the regular base programs within the cap of the, you know, BCA, the Budget Control Act cap for national security. But I would also say that what happened, I mean, we tried as hard as we could at OMB and we developed criteria for assessing what belonged in the war pot and what belonged in the regular pot for defense. And we got, and I suppose I would say this is one of the accomplishments that I feel pretty good about. We were able to get agreement with the department on what those criteria were, but that was a huge fought out, long fought out battle, so to speak.
So partly it's a matter of definition. What is war-related and what is normal, unwar-related defense spending? But you could also argue that over time, what looked like an emergency, that is, you have to go to war, you have to do a lot of things that you didn't plan for in the regular budget process, so there's an argument for treating that as something outside the normal process, outside the caps.
There is.
But over an 8-10 year period, that argument gets a little strained, doesn't it? Is there any reason now why the war should be treated as a separate category of spending?
It does get strained, and I think the response that the Department of Defense would make is that when you have these artificial caps, as we have now, as a result of the Budget Control Act, you have forced them essentially into this emergency funding because there's no way they can do all that they need to do to achieve what they consider their base program and to be ready for whatever wars lie ahead or battles lie ahead and fight the current war. That's a debatable proposition. Very debatable, and that was something that we were constantly having discussions with the department about. And I think some years we were more successful than others. I think the department now, and I've been away for 3 years, but I think I've read that the department is even admitting that there's up to $30 billion in that OCO fund now that probably is really base.
Out of what total for OCO?
Well, if they ask for OCO funding of about 60.
So about half of it then. Could arguably be.
Now not everyone agrees with that number. But it is out there. I've seen analyses that say anywhere from 15 to 30. So of the 60, yes, that's a fairly substantial portion. And you could argue that, that's giving defense a free ride, so to speak, relative to the domestic agencies.
Which had no
who don't
equivalent,
get
yeah.
that kind of
Other than for true emergencies, like natural disasters.
Natural
they get
disasters,
that sort of
and
supplemental.
right, but supposedly those should be
Yeah.
funded for what the emergency need is.
Yeah.
But that's sort of it was always an ongoing issue in my view, and one of the biggest things that I sort of focused on because, it's a lot of, 15,
Yeah.
20 billion on top of what the real Oakland need is a lot of money.
It's hard for me to imagine how you can reduce to any kind of formula how much is enough for defense. This is a variation, sort of the bigger question of, the U.S. spends more than any other nation by far on defense. We have
Probably in the next
an incredible
10, 15 nations.
incredible worldwide reach and capability.
Right.
So how do you, in the budget process every year with defense, how do you say enough is enough? Where do you is there an argument that can be made, because there are all these other competing priorities always for the budget? Is there a rational argument that OMB advanced about how much is enough, or is it strictly a political call by the Defense Department, the President, what they think Congress will go for?
Well, given that defense is defense and is so politically sensitive and of such a high priority, almost any president wants to get it right. He doesn't want to take any risk.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you might make arguments in OMB, and we failed to get a lot of sympathy. But more specifically, in answer to your question, there is obviously a national security strategy and a quadrennial defense review which lays out the priorities for the department. In both those cases, though, they're at a very high level of generalization, as you well know, and going from that level to what your budget is, you can come up with a lot of different budgets that might fit those broad strategies.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, they help frame priorities and give you direction as a budget person, but they're not, definitively helpful.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
But at least there's a notion of, this is our strategy, this is what capabilities we need to have in order to deal with the threats that we perceive
Yes.
going forward.
And, obviously, let's take an example. Cyber is identified as a big priority.
Right.
And if you look at that budget, it has really grown and will continue to grow, and I think it should. Climate change, interestingly enough, is in the Defense Quadrennial Review as something that the department needs to pay more attention to.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some additional funding there. So there is a connection between the strategy and the Quadrennial Review.
Right.
And the budget. But I think sort of one layer down in generality would be the annual program review that's done within the department. That really has as its genesis the initiatives of former Secretary McNamara going way back to the 60s.
So this was called PPBS, or Planning,
PPBS.
Programming, Budgeting Systems,
Right.
originally, and that was
Right.
McNamara. He brought that from the Ford Motor Company,
Yes.
right, to the defense.
Yes, exactly. And I think that is a really solid process within the department.
Mm-hmm.
And in a minute, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about what we call the joint review.
Mm-hmm.
But as part of our joint review, OMB would sit in on that program review held at DOD every year.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the department's best and brightest would do analyses on not every single program. You can't do that every
Right.
year.
Right.
But they would pick those programs where there were issues, issues defined by having major cost overruns, huge performance issues, political questions coming up from someplace, the White House, the Hill.
These would be
the
weapons
Secretary.
development programs, things like that?
Weapons development programs, obviously, the F-35, the Apache helicopter, whatever. So weapons programs, but also, more recently, I think, in the last few years, some of the benefit programs for our military, whether housing, health, pay,
Retirement.
right, child care, retirement, as you know. And those were, for me personally, some of the more interesting discussions, because if you look at that portion of the defense budget, and this is where I think we at OMB were really raising a lot of questions, it's in that portion of the budget that you see very significant growth. Faster growth than in the procurement side or the R&D side. And looking at that and understanding, all those choices, and they were difficult discussions because, especially in a time when you are putting lots of demands on your military, it's hard to have those kinds of discussions. The discussion always is, we do whatever we can to make them healthy psychologically and physically, and their families happy, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, they have their own education, system.
So what share of the defense budget is that sort of support for the personnel, military in particular? Do you know?
I should look at the latest. It depends how you define it, but it's I think a good half.
And that's the growing half. It's growing. It's squeezing the rest,
yes,
because it's growing because of healthcare costs growing.
Right, healthcare in particular has really grown over the last 10 years or so, and OMB worked closely with DoD, usually the Comptroller's Office, or CAPE, which is their analysis and program analysis, or the program analysis office, to come up with proposals to reduce that growth rate. For example, the military can retire after 20 years of service, and the vast majority of them go get other jobs. So, they're getting both their pension and their new income. I'm not saying they're not entitled to that. They are, but...
And they get veterans benefits at a certain point, too, right?
Well, if they have, yes, if there's any, most of them, yes, they can go take advantage of the Veterans Hospital benefits.
Or GI Bill,
the GI Bill, they can go get additional education.
Home mortgages.
And their family members as well.
So that's part of the, we don't think of that as necessarily all part of the defense budget, but it's kind of separate in people's minds, but it's part of the cost of maintaining our military readiness.
And if you also look at, one of the very fast-growing program in veterans, it's their disability compensation program, which is an entitlement. And I think there are a lot of experts in that area who believe that, it's so sensitive it just never happens, but there might be some things that one could do in terms of improving that program. Maybe there are certain kinds of quote-unquote disabilities that really aren't disabilities anymore, that don't prevent you from working, such as, I don't know, the funny example they always give is hemorrhoids. Why is that a disability? Do you really, and there are several others in that category. But we raised some of those issues, but in the veterans area, it's very, very hard to get that kind of solid analysis.
Well, I want to come back to some of the challenges facing the budgeting for defense going forward, but you mentioned some distinctive characteristics of the process that separated from the the process that's gone through in reviewing the annual budget requests of other agencies. You mentioned the joint reviews, for example.
Yes.
And so it is quite different for those who are familiar with the regular process, where the agency spends a lot of time on its own developing its budget proposals, whatever they turn out to be, and brings those in the fall to OMB. And then the examiners at OMB look at those and review them and essentially make recommendations to the director, to their political leadership about what to support. Then they pass that set of decisions or marks back to the agency, and then there's a brief round of appeals, and then decisions are made finally in December or January, and numbers are and policies are locked down at that point. It's different, isn't it, for defense? How can you talk about the process and how different?
Yes, it is different, and it's a difference that goes back to really the beginning of the Department of Defense. It's been around a very long time. It's referred to as a joint review, but I'll say up front that the quality of the jointness will vary sometimes from administration to administration or personality to personality, depending on who's the comptroller, the secretary. Having said that, the first big difference, and you pointed to it already, is that the Department of Defense does not submit a budget to OMB in September or October as do other agencies. And, you know, when I first went into that division, that security division, having been on the domestic side, I kept raising, well, why not? Why can't they put that budget together? And get it over and we can review it, have something to look at sooner. Never won that. They basically say it takes them too long to get their budget together. They can't have it ready by September. But what does happen, and I think there's some real benefits to this, is that the staff, OMB staff, are invited over to early discussions within the department and sit in on various programmatic reviews, and can, you know, they have voices at the table and can raise issues saying, you know, OMB has some concerns about this, or OMB likes this, or you're not taking into account a priority right now that we're picking up from the National Security Council. So there's that give and take and sharing of information and signals very early on in the process. I think that's actually a good thing.
At that point, do they have a top line mark that they're
Yes,
told
at that
they have
point
to live with?
Yes, they do have a top line mark.
Okay.
We would have sent them that guidance before that.
Okay.
And the comptroller would have spread out, you know, allocated that mark to the various military offices or services. So,
Okay.
yes, they do. And that doesn't mean that their initial submissions aren't within it. They're usually
Right.
not.
Right.
But
Which would be true of other agencies as well.
yeah, right. So I think that participation is a really good thing. And I've often wondered if that wouldn't be at least something to think about.
Because the analysts
the
at OMB,
domestic
they
side.
learn a lot, and they
Yes, and it you know, it's a more, I don't think that OMB gives up much of its equities in that process.
Yeah.
You're sharing information.
Right.
It's more of a collaborative style. But you reserve the right to, and you will, as we do, put a pass back together for defense, just as we do for all of the other agencies sometime in early December. You're reserving your right to put something in pass back that may be in conflict with what has come up through the department process.
Does the process vary very much with who is the Secretary of Defense or who's the President? Has it changed while you were there? Did you observe, or is it always very professional, routine kind of?
I would say it's fairly professional. Once it gets, though, to, okay, let me just describe one or two additional steps of the joint review. The big budget issues or program issues are settled or at least discussed by a senior group of military officers, the 4 stars, and secretaries of the services, along with the deputy secretary.
Mhm.
That group meets frequently during the latter part of the budget season. Starting in, September, October, November, and then more as you get closer to December.
Mhm.
And the deputy then will make decisions, sometimes in those meetings, sometimes not in those meetings, that then go to the secretary. OMB is invited and represented in those deputy meetings.
Mhm.
And I sat in on a lot of them. I found them extremely interesting and helpful. I think sometimes some of the senior military were a little uncomfortable with OMB being in the room. Other times they liked us being in the room. It depended.
Mhm.
Then you would have, as an OMB representative, you would have a sense of where the secretary, deputy secretary was leaning.
Mhm.
But you didn't get, and if I have a frustration with the system, would be this: sometimes he or she would make the decision after the meeting, and the communication of that to OMB was not always very transparent.
Uh-huh.
So once it left that meeting, it became somewhat of a black hole.
Mhm.
And this is I think, from an OMB perspective, a bit of a flaw in it. In the most critical part of this process, it becomes a black hole, and
When do you find out what's in that black hole?
you would not see you never got a budget until all of a sudden they're putting the data into the system of OMB.
Mhm.
And that's in December. Now, this is where the quality of your relationships with the department are so critical.
Mhm.
I was, on the phone all the time with the senior people at DOD, and I gave them information that was useful to them. They gave me information, so that most of the time I knew
Yeah.
exactly where there were going to be.
There was enough communication going on.
Yes,
You
there
could
was.
Figure it out.
If
Did-
you don't have that, though, you can have, that's where the system could break down.
Now, you're the top career person,
Mhm.
but you report to an associate director of OMB who's a political appointee.
Right.
Did that person have to intervene at times, or was that
Oh,
helpful?
yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Get a little leverage that way if you need it.
Oh, more than, yes. And then, of course, it could go very quickly up to the deputy or director, very quickly.
And I recall.
Depending, there's where it depended on the secretary. I mean,
Yeah.
like Rumsfeld had absolutely no clue. He would be on the phone to the director, like,
And
one time I remember, I was told by my then pad to, I can't even remember what the message was, but it was to call over to the department and give a signal about what the mark was likely to be the past, and within an hour, Rumsfeld was on the
Mhm.
phone to the director.
Right. I recall in the Reagan administration, Cap Weinberger, who had been an OMB director previously, a BOB director, and the Secretary of Defense would come in with charts and present graphics to the President Reagan, showing a big Russian tank and a smaller U.S. tank,
Absolutely.
and arguing for a big increase in the defense
Yeah.
budget. So, was that unusual to have the President making choices in the defense level of defense spending? Has that happened since then, or is that unique, that period of time?
Well, yeah, it's not unusual. The top line for defense, the amount of money for the war pot,
Mhm.
almost always involved, if not the president, national security advisor, and the chief of staff to the president, but most of the time the president was,
Mhm.
yeah.
And once let's talk about the congressional stage of the process a little bit, which is also different for defense, and how well behaved DoD is in that process as well. One of the unique characteristics of the defense budget annually on the Hill is that there's a separate authorizing bill that passes alongside the appropriations bill. Usually they go roughly in tandem. You probably know better than I just what the variations are on that. So a lot of the work that might be done in an appropriations bill can be, in terms of giving policy guidance to the department and so on, could be, I assume, done in the authorization bill. How do those two pieces of legislation join or
Well, I
interact?
would say you've got policy guidance in both the appropriations and authorization bills.
Okay.
You have two very strong committees who work well together generally, who respect each other's turf, and are very aggressive in making sure, you know, they have voices, and in the sense that the authorization committee would consider it a major failure if it didn't get its bill out every year, and it has succeeded.
So what's in that bill as opposed to what's in the appropriations bill, if they're both giving policy guidance of one kind or another? Why do we have two bills, I guess?
Well, you have in the authorization bill, and you know, I think you're asking even a more fundamental question: do you need that bill really every year? And there were times when some of us argued that you did not.
Because for the rest of the government, an authorization bill is an increasingly rare occurrence. Sometimes
I know.
programs are not even reauthorized; they
I
just
know.
continue to get funding.
I know.
Yeah.
I don't think that will ever happen in the case of defense.
Mhm.
Would it be the end of the world if it happened, you know, you didn't have a bill every year? I don't think so.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I don't think it will happen. I think
There are enough people who are interested in the defense budget.
oh yes.
Staff too.
And stakeholders on the outside.
Yeah.
There's a lot of authorization that relates to the benefits
Mhm.
of the military.
Okay.
They're always tinkering with the authorizations for benefits, usually expanding them. There's focus on acquisition programs, issues about how the Department of Defense should be organized in terms of its management of its acquisition programs, which get a lot of criticism from GAO and others, rightfully so. But there's debates that go back and forth about what's the best way to do acquisition reform. All of that is within the context of the Defense Authorization Bill.
Okay.
You also have all of the NNSA stuff, excuse me.
This is you're securing the nuclear waste materials.
This nuclear waste, but also the big challenge right now is the modernization of our nuclear stockpile, making sure it's reliable, and there's huge costs associated with that.
Mhm.
There's issues about our national laboratories and the weapons infrastructure.
And that's in the Energy Department, but it's in the
Energy Department.
It's in the process.
but
It's in your
It's in
set of
my
bills.
bailiwick, and it's part of 050.
which is a function for defense.
Function 050, which is the Defense National Security Function.
Mhm.
And one of the most contentious issues in the later years of working at OMB in that position concerned how much money we put into modernizing the nuclear weapons complex and refurbishing various nuclear weapons in the stockpile. Because that's, as you can imagine, a significant number. And the bigger that number, so you've got one cap, right,
Mhm.
that fits DoD and NNSA, as well as the intelligence community. DoD gets about 95% of that cap. But if you're going to start really expanding NNSA, it has to come out of DoD.
Uh-huh.
And all of a sudden, it was fascinating to watch how DoD reacted to that, as you can imagine. and started getting very involved in looking at other DOE programs that it thought could be cut. One of which was called MOX, anyway, it's a long story. It was very, very contentious.
Uh-huh. And just to complete the picture of the Hill activity that's related, there's a separate appropriations bill for Veterans Affairs, I believe, and military construction.
Yes, you have
different
two appropriations bills for defense, and you have one authorization bill, but, excuse me, let me make that a little bit clearer. You have your defense appropriations bill and you have your military, your VA military construction bill.
Right.
And the construction programs in the appropriations bill have authorizations in the defense authorization
Okay.
bill. Anything to do with VA, while appropriated in that VA MILCON bill,
Mhm.
has authorizations in separate authorizing committees.
Different committee.
Yes,
Authorizing
different,
committee.
who don't always get a bill out every year.
Yeah. Good. Well, it's a big budget, so it's not surprising that there are multiple
Right.
pieces of legislation and committees. So you said you don't see much of a change when the president changes, or when the Secretary of Defense changes in the process for putting the budget together for defense? Is that too sweeping a statement?
Well, you do see some changes, but I wouldn't say they were basic changes in the process.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, again, I think anecdotes might highlight some of the differences that you would see. Under President Obama, the First Lady and Second Lady took extraordinary roles
Mm-hmm.
on military issues, particularly military family issues that affected both the VA and the Department of Defense. And they were, you know, there were some budget issues that had been signed off at highest levels, and then they got involved and some changes were made.
Uh-huh.
That was unusual.
Yeah.
That was unusual. I think, you know, the relationship between the Secretary of Defense and the President can vary. Rumsfeld had an extremely close relationship with Bush and Cheney, so that was one model. I think there have been other Secretaries of Defense who, you know, were not on the phone just all the time with the President.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see that. But defense being defense, generally, its big issues are going to get the attention of high-level people, and more often than not the President. So you just, when you're working in this world, you just have to accept that that's going to be the case.
I should ask you about execution of the budget in defense, because it is a real challenge. There's so much money flowing in so many different directions, and the Defense Department's never successfully completed a set of audited financial statements, which I think is the
That's right.
only department to fail to do that so far. But that, again, is a reflection perhaps of the scale.
Is it really, it probably is the only department that's failed?
I think so.
I think that's
It hasn't
right.
got audited, clean audit. Did your staff have any time left over from all of the other activity to try to dig into some of the management challenges on the financial side or otherwise at procurement and so on at DoD? They're perennial problems that
Right.
everybody works on all the time but don't ever seem to get solved.
Yes. Well, yes, they did. And we worked on them within the frameworks of different administrations and the way they handled their approach to management.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the Bush administration, as you well remember, it was the President's management agenda and the kinds of meetings we had tracking management priorities, sort of cross-cutting management priorities, and we worked, you know, people put a lot of time into that in the defense side. And also at DoD. I think that approach worked pretty well.
Mhm.
I'd say there are two reasons for it. People at the top paid attention. And if you don't have people at the top paying attention, then attention won't be paid
Mhm.
throughout the institution. And the second, I think there was a clarity to that system, and there was priorities. There were priorities set in that system.
Yeah.
We weren't doing everything. There were a set number of things, and so I would give that particular approach a high grade. So yes, we were extremely involved, and I would say also that we got lots of good cooperation from the Defense Department and Intel Department, and we were sort of on our own. We really pushed to apply all of those presidential management, that whole process to the intelligence community. They had never had that before, so
That's good.
that was an interesting experience, but I think very helpful one. I think there was another exercise you remember well, a program assessment rating tool.
The PART, yes.
PART.
In the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration.
Yes, that was a huge burden for us just because of the large number of programs in DoD. And why was it a burden? It was because we were doing absolutely every single program.
Mhm.
It's a good goal, but it almost killed us. That was, the staff burden there was extraordinary.
Uh-huh.
So if I were to give any recommendation, it would be, pick a targeted number of things. You can't do everything all at once. I also believe that if you don't have the agency on board with you, that this particular issue is something that is important, it's just almost a wasted effort. And sometimes that has happened, and DoD, you spend all your time fighting with DoD, and that can undermine you considerably. I mean, they really disliked PART. They thought it was a waste of time. At the same time, it's getting all sorts of awards from outsiders. So, I think when doing, working on the management issues, I like the idea of the director of OMB sitting down with the agencies, the White House, the Hill, and developing a top-level set of really big issues that everybody agrees on, and then working collaboratively. That process can vary, but working collaboratively with the agencies.
And the Obama administration has been more selective and targeted its efforts on a subset of everything it could work on.
I think that they moved in that direction, yes.
But all of those things that you just mentioned are part of a sort of long-term change, probably affects other agencies more than defense, in the focus shifting from just process and compliance toward trying to measure what your results are, or what you're aiming at least, be clear about that, and then manage to those objectives. And under the GPRA, Government Performance and Results Act, civilian agencies have been working in that direction for, I guess, now more than 20 years. But there's a tradition of obviously strategic thinking and planning and programming and budgeting and linking all those together in one system in DoD that goes, as you said, much farther back than GPRA.
Way back,
So,
yeah.
and maybe GPRA is kind of irrelevant to what DoD is doing because they're already doing something like that, or is that not true?
I would, probably for me to say it's irrelevant, but I think, I believe that the system they have is essentially achieving a lot of what GPRA, or was it now GPRA MA?
Modernization Act, right, since 2010.
Once, obviously in the case of DoD, it's just DoD. So when you have some issues crossing DoD and BA, and there are some big issues and there's some real problems, then, this is where OMB and working either under the aegis of GIPRA or just, pulling people together as we did, high-level people to have meetings to go over this.
Mhm.
One that, I would say was probably not very successful was trying to get a singular health record, electronic health
Sure,
record.
medical records, yeah, they have different systems, they don't
And then
communicate.
the transition of military to becoming a veteran and what happens,
Yeah.
to their, not only their health record, but what kind of counseling do they get and what kind of support do we give them in terms of transitioning to the private sector.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So those are those issues that really don't get caught up in that annual review at DOD. And that's when OMB with the National Security Council would organize meetings. And I think, that most of the time they were pretty successful.
So let's end this discussion with sort of look ahead at some of the challenges from a budget standpoint to the defense world. As we're talking, we're on the eve of a presidential election. We don't know who the next president's going to be necessarily. But whoever that is going to face some big international challenges and risks that may not even have been identified at this stage. Do we have a system in place that will ensure that the resources are going to be there to deal with all of those threats as they arise? Are you comfortable that we've got a good system for planning and budgeting for defense that is resilient enough to handle whatever challenges we might face? And what would be some of the biggest challenges for a new president and Secretary of Defense to deal with?
Well, again, the department is known for its strategic planning, and that's always, I think something it does very well. But I think the bigger, more interesting question is, how you budget for the future. Yes, it has an outward budget plan, unlike other federal agencies. There is a 5-year budget plan, and there is a very detailed programmatic breakdown year by year that is consistent with the overall strategy. And that, I think, is a second thing I give the department kudos for, because that takes a lot of work to do that.
Yeah.
But it's the focus on the long term, and it is designed to be in sync with the defense strategy. Each year it's changed a little bit. It's revisited every year. So it's alive. It's moving. Taking into account, what Congress has done and any new actions, or not actions, but new things on the world scene.
Terrorist attacks, cyber attacks.
Right.
Whatever.
But ultimately, you never know exactly what's going to happen. If there's some national security event that we don't anticipate, and there will be, we will have to deal with that as we have in the last 10, 15 years, either through supplemental funds or hopefully we can take care of it, and as we did with some of the smaller things within the base. Your biggest cost always is going to be your number of military that are needed for whatever event it is.
Right. And that has a long tail. If you bring people in, then you're going to support them probably through retirement in some cases, many cases, or deal with their injuries and
Sure.
battle and so on.
Sure.
So there's a big cost.
Absolutely,
to personnel.
absolutely. So I think, the emphasis is on agility and planning, and sort of those two processes are both needed.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other concern of Secretary Carter, all secretaries of defense, are just investing in technology, innovating. How do you innovate? And just given the pace of technological change and the number of actors in the world, that's that's a much bigger challenge, I think, over time, has become a big challenge.
So you had a big job for 13 years, 13 very eventful years filled with conflicts and surprises and shocks to the system.
It's an interesting time. I'm glad to have been there.
Okay, I'm talking with Kathy Peroff, who has spent a big part of her federal career in the Office of Management and Budget, and I think almost 30 years, is that?
Mm-hmm.
I spent almost 20 years there. We started at the same time, and yet you're younger than I am. I don't quite understand how that arithmetic works.
Yeah.
But it seems to
Not
be the case.
quite.
It's approximately correct. So you have having served at senior levels of OMB for most of that time, and through several presidencies and changes of leadership and director and so on, you have a pretty good sense of that institution and how it functions and how well it functions and the kind of people who work there and what it does for the president. Can you talk a little bit about OMB as an institution? How would you characterize its role in the government? How would you characterize what it contributes to the governing process?
Well, you know, when I first went to OMB, I thought I was going to stay about 3 years, and I stayed there almost 30. So I guess that says something about the place, in the sense that you're right at the center. You're part of the executive office of the president, and if you have an interest in policy and where policy interacts with politics at the highest levels, there's really no other place that, and also interacts with the issue of money and allocation of resources, obviously.
That's right. So you can see the whole process from where you are in that high-level perch.
High-level perspective.
And you can see it in real time as it
in
unfolds.
real time, and you get to meet a lot of interesting and talented people across the federal agencies and, of course, within the White House.
Mm-hmm.
What you don't get to do is, you know, run a program which has its own, I think, challenges and benefits. I never, you know, I worked in a federal agency for a while before I came to OMB, so I always valued that experience as well, about 6 years, because sometimes I think it's easy for discussions at OMB to become a little bit too high level, and when you've actually been in an agency and had to make something happen, it's a totally different challenge. That's why I think I've always been a big believer in people moving around a little bit, doing details in agencies in particular, and then coming back to OMB. And there's a cross-fertilization that I think is really helpful for the government overall.
Well, that's an interesting observation. You are a political scientist, as am I, a student of government, and for a student of government, that's sort of the great place to be in order to really understand how the government works from the inside, be able to see it all that unfold. And people who are outside the Beltway, especially in the heat of a political campaign, there's a sense that government is failing frequently, that we shouldn't trust the people who are running the government, sometimes not distinguishing between the political leadership and the Congress and the presidency and civil servants who work in the executive branch. But what is your reaction to that kind of public view of government?
Obviously, I spent my entire life in public service, and it was a very meaningful period for me, and I have no regrets. Just had tremendous opportunities to meet all kinds of people and to work on issues that were, you know, extraordinarily important, both on the domestic and the national security side. So,
what about the people at OMB?
I think that the people at OMB are an extraordinary group, really talented, and there are all kinds of people. They're not just public policy, I mean, coming in with public policy backgrounds. There are people with Ph.D.s in chemistry. I had a Ph.D. and one of my staff in NSD, or National Security Division, had a Ph.D. in physics, economics, business, health policy, depending on the kinds of portfolios that they were responsible for. So you have a diversity of backgrounds, and people who have made a choice to come to a place where they're not going to get rich, but where they're going to be working on some extraordinary issues. And they work hard and long hours. I think over time they work less hours at OMB than they used to, but they have their various Blackberries or
handheld devices,
iPhones, and they're working at home.
Yeah.
And so there's a big emphasis on nonpartisanship, on competence, on looking at all options, whatever the sort of goal is of the new administration that's coming in, speaking truth to power. It's a place where you feel good when you go to sleep at night. You don't feel like you've had to ever bend any of your values.
So that's part of the culture of the place. People make a real conscious effort all the time to give the full story and an accurate, balanced story on any issue to the leadership.
Absolutely.
And they're trying. It's sort of a paradox in a way. They're serving a partisan leader, and they're obviously trying to help that person of either party succeed. And when the president changes, shifting gears a little bit.
Yes,
but they're still
some
trying to
people
help
probably
whoever's
wonder,
right.
how does that happen, or how does that really work? But it does work. You have your political appointees coming in. They have their agendas, and they appreciate after, and maybe not right at the beginning. Sometimes there's a transition period where they have to learn about what OMB does, and that we're trustworthy and we're not going to leak to the press or others. And once that trust is built up, and it usually builds up within a pretty short period of time, that relationship is a very wonderful thing, because there's a synergy there that somehow means we end up getting our president's budget together every year, and carry out the management agenda. I think the importance of making this point, that if someone really wants to be partisan and work for a particular party to carry out that party's agenda, they might be frustrated at OMB because you never know who's going to be the president. So whenever interviewing people, I would always say, okay, sometimes you're working for a Democrat and sometimes you're working for a Republican, and you have to be able to do that. But I think generally that is not maybe as hard as you might think it is. Because lots of times when it comes to issues about programs and money, there are lots and lots of constraints. Governing is a much different process than campaigning. You're all of a sudden in the world of gray and constraints and competing interests and different agendas on the Hill, and figuring out how you can move something along. And it's much more complicated, I think, than writing a policy piece and giving a speech.
Yeah. So say a little bit more about the work of OMB. What are some of people think of budgeting, of course, putting the president's budget together as the central task of the institution, but there's a lot more that goes on.
There's definitely a lot more.
In order to help the president
budget is just
succeed.
one thing that OMB does. As its title implies, it also has responsibility for management, and how we define what that management role is going to be varies considerably from administration to administration, much more so than that basic preparation of the budget. And probably that is one thing where there, some people feel that the management side is has always been somewhat of a a stepsister in the sense that it doesn't have that exactly same role and process from administration to administration. I'm probably in the category of thinking, maybe that's okay, because sometimes there are different ways to do management oversight, whether it's, I can remember during the first Bush administration under Director Darman, he set up what they called SWAT teams, where working together jointly with the agencies, OMB staff and agency staff work together on particular management issues. And I can remember being on one of those teams working, looking at financial systems issues at HUD. That was, for me, that was a very good experience. And when we finished our report, we gave our briefing to both the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and to Darman and other advisors around the room. I thought that model worked pretty well. I also thought, the President's management agenda process under the second Bush administration worked pretty well. Very, very different. So, I'm not so sure it has to be exactly the same.
Yeah. It helps to have high-level presidential
The
attention,
most important thing is high-level attention. If you don't have high-level attention, the institution is not going to have attention. And I can't say that enough. I'm probably not a big, proponent one way or the other of particular organizational setups. Some people say, well, we need a management czar in addition to the OMB deputy. I'm not so sure about that. I think it should, if the president doesn't care and the director doesn't care, then we've got, it's hard to make management oversight work. They have to really care about those things. And as well, I think what we call the program associate directors, these are the political appointees who have responsibility for agencies or clusters of agencies. They've got to care. And sometimes that's been, I think, an issue. They see themselves as primarily just budget, and I think that's really...
That tends to be their background. They're policy people and they're budget
problem,
people, but they're not
their
management
background.
types.
That I think is something that really has to be examined. Your face to the agency has to be both your budget management face has to be one face, and that's my particular view.
Well, I want to come back to this question in a few minutes of how to make OMB an even more effective organization than it is. But since you've spanned this series of administrations and you've seen OMB as an institution change over time, can you talk about some of the ways it's changed? It's always had, during this full period of time, going back I think to almost the 70s, it's had about the same number of staff. It's about 500 staff, more or less, year to year. So it's a very small organization.
Yes, it is.
In bureaucratic terms.
Yes.
And it's had about the same budget. If you adjust for inflation, it's about $100 million
Right.
budget every year, today's dollars. So it hasn't changed in a superficial way. It's the same organization as it was 30 years ago, 25 years ago. But it has evolved over time, and it's been given more and more to do, right? It seems like always new legislative requirements, new things that are thought up that only OMB can be asked to do, it seems, or lead.
Yes, I think that's where that's a challenge for the institution right there. What you've said.
So was it very different when you started than it is today as an institution, or is there continuity?
I think that the biggest change in OMB since I started there is the decrease in the amount of time for thinking long-term, doing analysis, and that, I think, is a sad thing. I don't think that's a healthy thing.
What's squeezed it out?
And
What are they doing more of?
What has squeezed it out would be, one, maybe the proliferation of duties, both statutory and otherwise.
So there's been a series of statutes enacted that have, like
Right.
the chief financial officer's statute
Right.
and IT, various IT
Right.
management requirements and so on.
Right.
Just layer new responsibilities
Freedom of
on
Information
OMB.
Act requirements.
Right,
Um,
right.
And secondly, the 7/24-hour media environment in which the White House lives.
Hmm.
The demands that that has created on the White House complex has certainly impacted OMB.
Hmm.
As the Deputy Associate Director for Defense, I was getting a lot of phone calls from our communications office about, there's a reporter saying this, and they've got a deadline of X, and they need an answer now. A lot of that was coming in, and that can break up your day very fast. And so, to some extent, I pushed back. We all pushed back a little bit. But the communications people would counter that. If you get a bad news story, if it gets out there for more than 24 hours, we've lost the story.
Yeah.
And so we had a lot of interesting discussions about how to handle the inquiries coming in from the reporters, and often then follow-on ones coming in from the Hill that were stimulated by the story.
So they weren't just asking you for information, they were asking you to help shape the story, or what?
They were asking for information. Is this true? Is it not true? And these are little often
Yeah.
anecdotes. You've got to really dig in. You've got to go to the agency and understand
Right.
what's going on.
But they wouldn't go right to DOD. They
Well,
come to OMB
we
because
tried to
OMB is
push
part
them
of
to
the
go to the
President's
agencies
office.
to do this, and
Okay.
they became a little bit better, but that is some training that will have to occur at the beginning of each administration.
Yeah.
Because they like coming to the OMB staff, because the OMB staff are fast. They'll respond pretty quickly,
Right.
and they sort of have a sense of how to answer a question that the press office likes.
Right.
They'll go to the agency, sometimes they get, they'll get a book rather than a paragraph.
Mhm.
But I think that is just something that's got to be managed, because that is, I understand the demands and requirements of that.
It's driving out time for analysis and digging into
It
how
is,
programs
definitely,
work, or
yes.
going out in the field
Definitely
and
doing
looking
that.
at how things are
And
working.
then on top of that, some of the work with the policy councils has taken away.
Policy councils, the Domestic Policy Council, National Security
I'm
Council,
talking
the
about the
National
Domestic
Economic
Policy Council, the National Security Council, the Environmental Quality, Council on
CEQ.
Environmental
Right.
Quality, and particularly in the national security world where I worked, your NSC staff has, well, I don't know what the staffing size is right now, but it's the size of OMB almost.
Yeah, I heard that.
Which is, I think, something that should be.
A lot of those people are detailed from the Pentagon.
Most of those people are detailed from either DOD, state, or the intelligence community,
Mhm.
which I think sets up an interesting dynamic, actually. It should be examined in more detail. But National Security Council's, director and National Security Advisor likes obviously having a big staff. So anyway, that is, I think, an interesting transition issue. But they have lots and lots of meetings. OMB likes to be present because some of those issues have all sorts of implications for programs and budgets.
Mhm.
But that eats up a lot of time.
Sure.
So you're integrated into the policy process. That's a good thing, but it can also take away a lot of time. There were days when I was just in one meeting after another, and you're trying to sometimes decide how important is this particular meeting. But if you're not present, you're present. Your absence is noted, and so you're always making these difficult choices.
Yeah.
So I think the decline in the longer term or analytic effort has come, probably almost unconsciously or organically as a result of OMB's being plugged in more into that policy process with these other councils, being plugged into the media response environment, and queries coming in from Congress too. I mean, the number of letters are coming in from the Congress.
Right.
It takes time.
So there's some irony in that, there's a general trend to encourage agencies to develop evidence as a basis for their policies, to monitor their performance, to report on their performance, measure things, to be more analytical, in other words, in the way they
Yes.
function.
Yes.
And here you have the central analytical staff for the president who is pressured not to be, to the point that they don't have as much time as they used to have to sort of say, what would be a different way of approaching this problem? But how could we use resources very differently to try to solve this problem than the way we're doing it now? So they tend to just don't have the time. That's a little ironic situation.
And I suppose, there are different options. One is you increase the number of staff at OMB. Probably not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
A second might be that you really start restructuring some of the work of OMB. We've never been successful at identifying lower priorities. But I think there are some lower priorities. And it may be, for example, that we don't need, and I'm sure I'll be shocked after I say these things if anybody sees this, but we may not need an examiner for every single little program in the federal government.
Right.
Or we just give it very cursory review.
Right.
We tolerate that risk in order to address greater risks that we're not addressing now.
Right.
Maybe we don't spend as much time, getting into some of the really small programmatic issues in every single agency. It's just that's sort of the same thing. If you're not examining them in that kind of detail, you don't need to attend all of, or have elaborate budget hearings on some of these programs.
Yeah.
Maybe we, we take a lighter touch on our review of testimony coming over from the agencies that's about to be given, or documents that are to be sent as reports by the agencies. We give them a lighter review. Maybe we don't even review some of them.
Well,
so there's less control of the message. There'll be some some things that go up to the hill that maybe the administration would prefer didn't, but OMB, they hopefully, if we've done this right, wouldn't be major issues. And we would have staff then able to focus more on bigger issues.
There have been a series of efforts to look at OMB and how it's functioning and to see if there are ways to improve it. And there was actually a reorganization effort in the Clinton years. OMB 2000 was called, but it was done in 1994, I believe. And that addressed one of the common, recurring, I should say, complaints about OMB, which is that the budget process and the management process are in separate silos.
Yes.
They compete for resources, as probably is a bit of an oversimplification. And the budget process tends to dominate and to squeeze the management side, so there's not enough attention to implementation policies. And the OMB reorganization in 1994 attempted to combine the M and the B. Actually moved management staff, reassigned them to the previous budget branches to create so-called RMOs, resource management organizations, which would see their responsibility as a continuum from developing policy and budget proposals to implementing those proposals and making sure that the agencies properly executed and carried them out so that you got the results that you wanted or sought after. How did that reorganization affect OMB as an institution? And did
Well,
it
I
stick,
think
or is it?
I am one who believes that was a move in the right direction.
Mhm.
I don't think it went far enough, because ultimately the decision was made that we wouldn't integrate completely because we weren't going to do anything that required legislative change, so that some of the individual management entities did not become integrated.
Mhm.
And I would probably go further and, integrate them really. So I just think that that is one way to get around this issue of M being inferior to B. To me, it's just it's almost a false distinction. These are two oversight functions that have to work together, and people
They can reinforce each other. Right?
have to reinforce each other, and our leaders of OMB, both the political leaders and the SES leaders, have to be held accountable in their performance evaluations for their work on both of those.
Mhm.
And I'm willing to acknowledge that there are different ways to do the M part of that, whether it's, performance evaluations or evidence-based initiatives, or, PART or PMAs, Presence Management Agenda. All of those were.
The RMOs were very much involved
very
in the presence
much
management
involved.
agenda, not just
And,
the budget side.
they're called budget analysts, or RMO analysts now. I mean, they think, if you talk to any of my analysts in NSD, that they were doing, good management stuff. But when things break down, it's because there still are some silos, and that integration doesn't happen, communication doesn't happen, or it happens after the fact when some decisions have been made. So, and then you can build up ill will within your institution, as small as we are, and sometimes that has happened. So, integration is really important.
Apparently, it's still a problem or an issue for many people.
It is.
Because there was a new report came out in October of 2016.
Yes.
Which is when we're talking.
Yes.
It just came out from the Partnership for Public Service, which criticizes the agency for still being too siloed, that people tend to stay in their silos, especially the M silo or the B silo.
And I agree with that.
And also for being caught up in too many low priority matters, which I think you would help.
Not everybody can agree what those low priority matters are. That's been one of our challenges. But I think that's where leadership comes in.
Yeah, and the third part of their critique, as I read it, is that OMB's culture is sometimes to say no to agencies, to try to critique and block them rather than to being more facilitative or supportive.
I'm not sure I agree so much with that, and I realize that was one of the messages there. Everybody can disagree with me on this, but I actually saw, in all of my years there, I did see some of that no business.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm not going to say it never exists, but I saw more often than not just the opposite, where OMB staff were often, working with their agencies to, whatever the issue was. It was much more collaborative.
Yeah.
And I think it had become and has become much more collaborative over time.
Yeah, the agencies I knew, but sometimes OMB's role was to say, why can't you do it this way?
Yes.
Try something new that you've been beating your head against the wall.
Absolutely.
Let's try something different.
And then I'll also cite one of those people I admire greatly, Alice Rivlin, who said, let's not forget, somebody has to say no, because there's always more demand for resources than available.
Which sounds like an economist.
Yeah. So, at some point, that's what OMB also does, and so, we can, call the director Dr. No or whatever, but, that's also ultimately going to be part of what he or she does. And believe me, on the big issues, the president's very involved. So, OMB will sort of be the face for some of those tough decisions, but.
So we agree on part of the critique at least with the partnership report, which is
Yeah.
there is still some siloing going on within OMB, small as it is.
Yes,
And even though people
yes,
talk a
I
lot
think, yes, there
across
is.
these
I
silos, it's
would
fairly
agree
easy to
with
reach
that,
across.
absolutely.
And
To some
there's-
extent, that's, some leadership on both sides, the B&M that
Yeah.
maybe could have worked on that more.
Yeah. Well, here's what they say, I'm just quoting from, or summarizing their report, as I understand it. Here's some areas where OMB could improve. One is pay more attention to the implementation of policies. Help the president and the White House
Policy
pay
or
more-
programs,
policies, programs,
Okay.
that is follow through, make sure that
right,
when something is passed and funded, that it doesn't, the work doesn't just stop there, the oversight doesn't stop there, that you make sure the agencies are actually effectively implementing. And implementation, of course, has been a big issue for some major initiatives recently, like the healthcare initiative. So maybe OMB has a role to play in helping implement it. That's one.
could I address that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Theoretically, I agree with that. But let's keep in mind, we have an agency of 450, 500 people.
Hmm?
The Office of Policy at the Department of Defense is 800. What you can do in terms of oversight on a particular program in an agency that's got hundreds, thousands of them, where really getting into the implementation of a program means, I think, a deep dive.
Yeah.
There are just basic limitations there.
Right.
So I think I would describe it differently. It would be, OMB should be, and I think we were, at least I was trying to do this, requiring evaluations of programs, if a new program was being set up or proposed in legislation, putting in a requirement for an evaluation that would be submitted at a certain time and then submitted to OMB and the Congress and others. Yes, there can, we should, I'm not disagreeing with this, I'm just saying,
Yeah.
let's be
There's
aware of
a
the basic
fundamental,
constraints here.
uh,
I think,
limitation of.
yeah, the
human
agencies
resources.
have to be the lead on implementation.
Right.
And their leadership has to be the lead on making sure that that implementation is going on. OMB will come in and pick and choose and look at certain programs, but we can't, I think, just the numbers don't allow it.
So easy to say, hard to decide
Well,
where to put your
exactly.
resources to really affect
Exactly.
implementation
Right.
and not lose track of all the other important missions, including these other targets for improvement, according to this report. One is OMB is a logical organization at the top of the bureaucracy to facilitate interagency coordination. And so many of the major policy initiatives of any administration are going to involve multiple programs across multiple agencies,
Yes.
and it is always problematic to get agencies to work together.
Yeah.
Say it's border security, you get the Department of
Yeah.
Homeland Security and Justice Department, the
yeah.
courts all in the same orchestra at
This
least.
one I agree with, and I know how hard it is.
It's hard.
Having
and that,
worked on it.
And that would be a
Many
big,
different kinds of cross.
that could be a big assignment.
It's a huge assignment.
Well, what about intergovernmental coordination? We used to have institutions that paid attention to the federal, state, local relationships and that collected data and did
They
analysis.
don't pay as much attention to
and
that
those,
anymore.
they're gone.
They're gone.
And OMB at one time historically had
Yes.
an Office of
We had
Intergovernmental Affairs,
I don't know how,
Uh,
I know we had them,
but now
most of them
it's
were
not there.
gone by the time I got there, but yes, that's gone.
So that could be something that OMB could take on as a new responsibility. What about fostering innovation across the federal government? This is another recommendation of this report, that OMB could do more to make the bureaucracy more agile and innovative. and adopting new practices and
Hey,
techniques.
that sounds nice.
Mhm.
I don't, for me personally, is that something that I think is the top priority of OMB? I would say probably not. That should be coming from the agencies.
Another.
However,
Yeah.
I have been involved in several kinds of what you call innovative things. Sometimes it was in bringing two different agencies together to work on a particular issue, and so I'm not saying no to it, but again, how much time do you put into innovation? Innovation is really important, but sometimes I think that, again, knowing where the opportunities for innovation are really depends on having a lot of knowledge of the programs and how they're working. Being there at sort of ground zero, that's what, that's the agencies. So I don't have that high on my list. I probably wouldn't agree with him as much.
OMB also, again, quoting from the report, should lead on the development of information and evidence and its application in the decision-making process and in management of programs. We have a wealth of information, but it's kind of locked up in databases, and a lot of people have recognized that there's opportunity there to integrate administrative databases, to build a body of evidence through that way, and also by evaluating programs over time, as you described, so that we actually have enough evidence about what works and what doesn't work to steer the ship a bit better, both at the budget through the budget process and in the way programs are implemented. Do you think that OMB should do more in that area?
Yes, I would support that. I guess, though, I would say this. I would put it more generically. OMB should always be, have as its priority, creating or encouraging more information than we currently have about how programs are working, getting evidence, getting real data on outcomes. If I think about the one frustration that I had throughout my years, and it was a constant, how often such data were not available. Or the data that were available were not very apropos to the particular decision that had to be made.
It's frustrating.
And that was a common finding across domestic and national security programs. So I always used to, I think I told you this once and sort of half in jest, but I would have loved to have had access to a pot of funds that OMB could have used to have studies done, by outside groups or laboratories, FFRDCs, on particular policy or program issues that would address some of the questions that we had. Of course, nobody ever wanted to give us that kind of money, but.
And the final recommendation or set of recommendations in this report is, again, to integrate the management and budget sides of OMB.
I agree with that.
And how would that be done? I mean, we tried it. It was tried in 1994, as I said, and that didn't stay. And since then, there have been more statutory offices.
I think there are two ways. One is you can, do a really radical reorganization of OMB and requires some legislation. So you might get rid of OFPP, the Office of Procurement Policy,
right,
and some of these other small offices, and take all those people and put them into these budget management units.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you would have a separate organization that has both budget management types that are sort of your in-house consulting people that sort of move around working on big issues.
That's good.
I've always liked that idea.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have been in that kind of organization, so you can work around the federal government on different issues, and I think increased learning within OMB that way. So I think, I haven't given it a lot of thought, but I would probably, if I, were king for the day or queen for the day, that would be something I would really want to look at.
So,
But, organizational change like that takes a lot of energy. A lot of energy, a lot of bureaucratic resistance, hill resistance. And so the question will be whether the new director is going to be willing to consider that. Failing that, I think within the existing organizational structure, there's some flexibilities you have to reorganize. I also think that there's got to be a cultural change at the very top about the importance of M and B and their being integrated.
Very
I can't
top
tell
meaning.
you how often I heard my pad say that I don't care about that stuff.
Right.
It's not important. Now, in fairness to that pad, and that wasn't just one, it was because they felt that they weren't significant enough issues, that there were really major other kinds of program management kinds of issues that should have been focused on.
Is it also a question of urgency? That is, imagine some issues have to be dealt with during the half-life of a director or an associate director, which is typically 2-3 years.
Yeah.
And so it may not be a priority for them to figure out how to solve the management problems of DoD or some other agency. They're going to be there long after they're gone.
Well, I
they
think
may
that's
have to deal with
a
some
very
immediate
good
crisis.
point, and it's maybe suggests the need for having an office that just focuses on longer term issues.
Right.
I mean, when you think of the fact that, and there's a statistic out there, like about over the next 10 years, 76% of all spending will be outside the appropriations process.
Mm-hmm. It's there now.
It's coming from all of our entitlement programs that are just on autopilot.
If you add in tax expenditures, it's even higher percentage already.
So,
That's
I
over
mean,
$1
that's
trillion.
a pretty,
Yeah.
just think about that.
Mhm.
We are spending all of this time and energy on, that's a quarter
Yeah. Right.
of the total resources of our federal government that going out, and
Mhm.
that doesn't make sense. And this is what bothers me. I mean, so there needs to be a place in OMB, and maybe this is, again, not just economists.
Yeah.
Excuse me, because sometimes I think they get very, you need economists, you need other kinds of analysts coming together and looking at some of these longer term issues, because we really do have a long term debt issue. I know that there are some economists out there publicly saying that the debt isn't an issue. Okay, short term, maybe not such an issue, but longer term, it really is an issue. I think OMB needs to provide more leadership on that issue.
So what advice would you give a new director when she or he takes over OMB in January of 2017? Should they spend time on OMB as an institution and trying to make it even more robust, and so it can do even more of these great things that are being recommended, or should they, as a member of the President's cabinet and a senior advisor to the President and being responsible for turning the President's priorities into legislation and budget and so on, should they spend all their energy, as they typically do, on those immediate tasks? And if they don't pay attention to the institution because they're not going to be there long enough, or they don't have time,
Yeah, I know.
who
I
can
guess
do that?
I would tell the director, you've got the PPS report, you've got the OMB strategic review that I worked on under Sylvia
Matthews.
Matthews. Look at those. talked to a few people. It might be, in my view, would be worth appointing somebody, your staff, your political staff, to look at this and come up with a set of recommendations on things you can do that require legislation, that don't require, that address some of these concerns. Yes, I think I would do that. Obviously, the director has got too much going on. He's going to have to delegate that to somebody who he or she really cares about. And, I mean, not cares about, but trusts to do that.
Right. So, in the
You would be good for that.
I'm retired.
Yeah.
In the period just ahead, the transition period, OMB takes on a special role. They're talking to the current occupants of those positions in the White House and in OMB and the agencies. And then they're also beginning to talk to a new cast of characters. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to go through a presidential transition, having been through several, and OMB's particular importance during that period of time, that sort of twilight between administrations?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very creative and chaotic time. I think you know, one of the things that I found is that in spite of all of the papers that have been written on transition and giving advice,
Mm-hmm.
at least the people that came into OMB, most of them didn't seem to have read them or paid much attention to them.
Sadly.
So, there's just OMB staff play a very important educational role.
Yeah.
And
They have the institutional memory when everyone else is
the
gone.
institutional
right?
memory when everybody is gone, and the extent to which they do that well, then they gain the trust of the people that come in. So it's really important that they do that well, that they don't look like they have particular agendas. And I think that in general, OMB staff have always done that very well, from everything I observed. Most of these people just have no idea about what OMB really is like, and so there's that tremendous education process that has to occur, and it'll start, you know, the day after the election, actually,
Mhm.
hopefully. So that educational process, you know, and whether it's a lot of written papers, sometimes OMB staff write reams and reams of papers, and again, I don't know, I have a feeling a lot of those aren't read either. I think short and sweet is better, and then just really punchy briefings.
Right.
And, you know, it's also the case that a lot of these people come in like to learn just by doing. I've heard that so many times that people go, oh, I'll just learn by doing, you know. Have the stuff come to me and I'll learn that way. Which actually isn't a good thing. I think it's really important for them to have the overall framework, and they understand
To know
OMB and
stuff.
all the functions and how it all works, and where there's some room for improvement. And I think especially if there is a desire to maybe make some changes in OMB to make it a little bit more cutting edge, relevant, efficient, that then has to be part of that message early on.
Yeah.
That's not going to be the interest in dealing with changing OMB is not going to be at the top of their agenda. So it may be that you make the pitch, but it ends up that they just, you know, we have too many other things that we want to do. I think, you know, that it's also important to get across the notion that, you know, it's a nonpartisan type of institution serving the president. And I could just remember in several conversations I had with new people coming in, they found that hard to understand, especially if they come from the Hill.
Yeah, where everyone who's hired is hired by some political person
Yeah.
for a political job. Yeah.
So,
Except for CBO, which is
you know, and they're viewing you in the context of the fact that you've just been working with the previous administration,
Right.
and if there's a change in administration, this becomes a much bigger sort of trust issue.
Yeah.
What was your
You-
question? Are there any, I
you-
can't remember,
you,
we were
uh,
talking about transition.
Well, here's my next and final question. So you spent a long time at OMB. Do you have any regrets of it? You could have done something different. You started out as an academic.
Yes, I
You
did.
came into government and you stuck.
Yes, I did. I was in academia.
Yeah.
No, I do not have any regrets.
Yeah. It's a
I
demanding
really
job.
enjoyed, as I said earlier, being at that nexus
Yeah.
of policy, money, politics,
Yeah.
and I like I guess I'm one that sort of likes the speed. Now, I don't want it, too crazy, but
Mhm.
the
And-
turnaround has an appeal to me.
Yeah.
Things are, by the time issues come to OMB, they're pretty big issues.
Yeah.
You can't just wait forever to sort of resolve them because,
Right.
they've already sort of been through that process. So
It's very demanding, sometimes exhausting work, right?
it can be exhausting, yes.
At the same time, it's exciting.